Hi, I'm Teodoro, and I recently finished my PhD degree at the University of Maryland. I had a defense that was online in Zoom, so there's a nice recording of it that I wanted to upload for people that I want to share this with. So if you're here, thank you. And here's the presentation. Below, there's also the different time points where you can jump to the three different studies, so you don't have to watch the whole thing. But yeah, I welcome your feedback, your questions, and if you're interested in more about it, please feel free to reach out. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation.
Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in today to my PhD defense. And thank you, to the guests. You've all met my very great and inspiring committee. I am truly grateful for all of them, for all of you personally, for your inspiration and your guidance all the way to this point. So, I also want to publicly acknowledge Maryland Sea Grant for their financing of my research, and Dr. Frederica Moser and Dr. Mike Allen, who's also here joining us. They've been a tremendous support throughout my last half of my PhD, and I really appreciate that, and the work that they're doing is really inspiring. So I'm really honored to be part of this. Without delay, I'll jump right in to my presentation, and the title of my dissertation is Participation in Climate Change Adaptation, the Role of Social Networks in Supporting Learning and Collective Action. But first, let me talk a little bit about myself. I am proud to be from El Salvador. I was born and raised there, and I left El Salvador 10 years ago to pursue higher education. But early on, I became aware of the environmental problems that are ultimately affecting the lives of many of the most vulnerable and poor people over there, and led me to pursue education in environmental science and policy. I did a master's in Budapest, where I focused on indicators of sustainable development, and I learned a lot about the role of science and policy and really what it takes to engage in real change. I went back to El Salvador after that to implement some of the work that I've learned, and I realized that it is more complicated than I thought. And there's definitely a lot that I needed to understand, and I lacked understanding of the social and environmental systems, and no one in El Salvador was able to teach me that. So I decided to pursue a PhD, because that's what normal people do. But in reality, climate-driven impacts affect different regions of the world in different ways. And I was very eager to understand these differences and how it affects the most vulnerable areas. And I realized there's an urgent need to address these impacts of climate change. However, there is a lack of quantitative measures in decision-making, and many of these are still in the making. So I really am glad to be part of these efforts, and I look forward to continue in this field. So let's start with the climate problem. The United States National Climate Assessment states that climate change is a threat to the management of social, economic, and ecological systems. And different parts of the world are affected different ways by climate change, but I focus on the effects of sea level rise due to the melting of polar ice and thermal expansion of ocean water, and how this rising of the sea level is affecting coastal communities really all around the world. But climate change is a complex problem and requires the collaboration of different stakeholders, including academia, government, and local and civil society organizations, working together to facilitate face-to-face interaction among people that would otherwise be disconnected. Stakeholder participation aims at facilitating a holistic understanding of the climate vulnerabilities. And perhaps one of the most advertised outcomes of participation is that it facilitates the transfer of knowledge and the production of new knowledge that is supposed to improve the overall capacity of communities to adapt to climate changes. However, stakeholder participation is an evolving science, and few studies exist that measure its performance. So we know it's costly to engage in participation and engagement. But when we do that, how do we know it's achieving the desired outcomes? It is also important to understand the concepts of learning and disentangling how the different social processes that support learning, which are not fully understood. So the aim of my dissertation is to explore how stakeholders in climate change adaptation develop social networks and how these relationships support learning and collective actions and collective outcomes. So I set out three main objectives. Number one is to conduct a systematic literature review of climate change impacts in the state of Maryland to understand the knowledge and institutional landscape. Number two, to evaluate the social networks of stakeholders engaged in a participatory process in a coastal region in the Chesapeake Bay. It's called the Deal Island Peninsula. Lastly, number three is to identify the social processes that drive network formation and perception formation tendencies among the stakeholders. Study one is a context analysis at the landscape level, focusing on the entire state of Maryland, where most of the impacts are occurring around the Chesapeake Bay. In study 2 and 3, I focus on one climate adaptation participatory project at the local community in the eastern shore of Maryland. It's called the Deal Island Peninsula. So in study 1, I wanted to understand the knowledge and data landscape of climate change impacts and adaptations in the Chesapeake Bay region. And I did this by employing a systematic review approach. This study has been published in the journal Climate. This study provides a synthesis of climate change literature in this area to identify trends and gaps. Also understanding, it's important to understand the availability of data and the data needs for effective adaptation actions. There is a complex institutional landscape in Maryland, given that it is important for economic reasons, for environmental reasons, for commerce. So many actors are involved, and it is important to understand and define this landscape in order to reduce redundancies in data focus and in data needs. So I reviewed scientific articles, non-academic reports from government, NGO, research institutes, as well as online resources published between 2007 and 2018. I started with 3,000 documents and filtered them based on geographic relevance, topic relevance, as well as whether or not they provided data or indicators of climate change impacts or adaptation measures. The final sample of 283 documents were coded qualitatively to determine and to identify the emerging themes and trends in this data. When categorizing documents by geographic focus and spreading out by year of publication in the top figure, we see that most of them focus on the state level and on the Chesapeake Bay level in dark green. When looking at them based on type of author in the second figure, the light green color shows that scientists contribute most of the knowledge. Finally, looking at the type of document, reports tend to be the most prominent format of published documents. When looking at the linkages between author types, document types, and geographic focus, we get an interesting picture. I think one of the things that stands out, and I want to draw your attention to, is that there's a disproportionately little focus on the local level indicators and climate data. This coincides with reports from local level authorities that they express a need for more granular data. It's interesting because municipalities and counties, they do have the power to enact policies and implement strategies that can make a difference at the local level in terms of climate change adaptation. However, we see a disparity between the data availability and data needs. The conclusion of this study is that climate impacts are being experienced and will continue to be experienced in the Chesapeake Bay and in Maryland. Communication gaps exist between different authors and stakeholders, but can be addressed facilitating communication opportunities and gathering perception data before and after interactions. Lastly, collaborative decision-making approaches have the potential to address more targeted knowledge needs at the local level. So now that we have a good understanding of the landscape, I move to the local level analysis of study 2 and 3. Here, I focus on the group of communities located in the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay along the east coast of the US. Their livelihoods primarily depend on the seafood industry, which you can imagine that when they're experiencing environmental change, it's really damaging. Primarily, they're experiencing increasing coastal flooding and shoreline erosion. So community members along the Chesapeake Bay, but especially in the Deal Island, are reaching out to the state of Maryland and to government authorities and researchers and other actors to work together to develop adaptation strategies. This is where the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership comes in. This is a multi-year project led by Dr. Michael Pauliso, an anthropologist, and which basically focuses on stakeholder participation, designed to identify vulnerabilities in a collaborative approach. There's a period of 2.5 years within this larger multi-year project where the integrated coastal resiliency assessment took place, and this project has a very specific aim to develop and identify vulnerabilities in a collaborative approach with a different set of stakeholders. This is where the data that I'm using for study 2 and 3 comes from. Social networks were part of this project and were used to monitor tide formation among stakeholders over time and to study how networks co-evolved with participants. So I think it's important that I mention some relevant concepts here so that, I'll be saying this frequently throughout the presentation. You've heard me talk about stakeholder participation already. And while this is one very good reference is this book by Cook and Kothari, Participation, the New Tyranny, which provides a very good reference, a word of caution on how sometimes participation can also have a dark side and can reinforce power dynamics. Social networks refers to the social relations that are linking set of stakeholders together. Here you can imagine the nodes of a network being the stakeholders participating in this project, and the connection between them, or the ties, are the links connecting them together. Two very important sources here from our very own Christina Prell is the Social Network Analysis book, as well as Social Networks and Natural Resource Management book. Finally, social learning is a loosely defined concept that is still being applied in different ways and is still an evolving theory. But here, I align to the definition that means that changes in individual views, beliefs, and or knowledge that results from the ongoing interaction among individuals involved in a participatory process. So social learning is really, in this study here, basically the changes in views, the changes in perceptions. So we're back to the Deal Island Peninsula. And this is where I employ the model-driven approach to quantify individual learning across multiple stakeholder networks. This study was submitted to the Journal of Environmental Management and is now under revision. The background of this study is that participation is seen as an important aspect of acquiring a holistic understanding of complex environmental problems. The literature suggests that participation leads to stronger social networks, which in turn facilitate collaborative learning, yet few quantitative measures exist that link these two processes together. So the aim of this study is to develop an evaluation framework of social learning as a result of social networks in a participatory environment, as well as to evaluate the role that different types of networks have on individual learning. So, setting up the conceptual framework, you can imagine that stakeholder participation brings people, diverse types of people together. Over time, these stakeholders will develop their social ties among them. And drawing from social contagion theory, we can imagine that individuals linked to others through social ties will be influenced by the views and behavior of others. In Spanish, there's a saying that parents tell their children, if you hang out with wolves, you will learn to howl. And it's basically the same principle. The data for this study, as I mentioned earlier, is from ICRA project and includes it includes the perception of climate change and 4 different social networks in 3 different waves. So the variable of perceptions of climate change is a combination of 7 survey items which gather respondents' beliefs of the extent climate change is a threat to their community. One of them, for example, highlighted there is the climate is changing in different ways from before due to the impacts of human activities, and they would rate how much they agree with that statement. The social networks, as you can see below, were collected by asking participants to nominate other participants in a roster and ranking the strength of their tie. For example, you would be asked, this person understands my views regarding the dip area and how much of that is true. I just want to emphasize here too that the last network there is an interaction. And the survey question was, do you interact with this person outside of the project? It is important to consider the interaction outside of the project because I want to control the influence that stakeholders may be exposed to inside of the project as opposed to outside of the project. So how do we operationalize this? You can consider actor A in the top left corner. Actor A has a very low perception score, but is connected with actor B, C, and D. We know who actor A is connected to. We know the strength of those ties and the perception scores of those connections. Social contagion theory would tell us that over time, actor A will shift his or her perceptions towards the perceptions of its neighbors. Here, you can see 3 different examples of how that contagion would happen depending on the strength of a tie. So the strength of a tie is very important when it comes to influence and being exposed to influence. I used the network panel linear model to estimate this and to predict the perceptions of climate change as a function of social networks. Essentially, we're predicting the perceptions of climate change as a function of different social networks, which were calculated as the product of a network matrix and perceptions of climate change. We're also including covariates in the model, which this can be age or gender or income, and we account for unobserved effects and the error term. So the results are in this big messy table, but I'll walk you through it. We predict in here perceptions of climate change. Each social network is a row in the pink box at the top, and below are the covariate and dummy variables. In summary, all of these networks are positive and significant predictors of perceptions. When combined into a single model, we can see that interaction network is significant as well as the influence network. The covariates are mostly insignificant in full models, except for age, and the negative coefficient suggests that older respondents tend to have a lower level of climate change perceptions. So what can we conclude? In general, results show that social ties based on mutual understanding, respect, and influence are associated with perceptions of climate change in our case study. Therefore, I believe that these networks are relevant in the evaluation of perceptions of climate change and the performance of participation in general. Even when controlling for outside project interactions, inside project networks can predict perceptions. So we can summarize this by saying that stakeholder networks are associated with stakeholder perceptions of climate change. In other words, if the neighborhood average perception would increase, then the perceptions of a person, of a stakeholder, are very likely to increase as well. I believe that this study addresses a scientific gap in the stakeholder participation literature that pertains to the role of social networks in predicting perceptions among stakeholders. I also use multiple social networks, which have not been tested in this context. This is something new. Contributes also to a better understanding of social learning in stakeholder participation, and it shows that multiple social dimensions do play a role in perception formation among stakeholders. Finally, I think that this study provides a very good case for an evaluative approach based on a theory of social contagion, which allows us to monitor performance of stakeholder participation approaches. Now, there's one thing that this study doesn't do, okay, maybe more than one, but the study does not show us the directionality of a relationship between the networks and perceptions. In other words, we don't know if mutual understanding ties are the result of similarity in perceptions or the other way around. So this is where study 3 comes in, where I disentangle the social processes in stakeholder participation in climate change adaptation. This study was submitted to the journal Social Networks. I also presented this paper last week on an international virtual conference, and I got pretty good feedback. Following the results of study 2, I wanted to understand the social processes that underpin that relationship between the networks and the perceptions. There are few empirical studies that investigate the longitudinal coevolution of networks and stakeholder learning over time. So the aim of this study is to study the coevolution of stakeholder networks with stakeholder views of climate change and disentangling the processes that lead to social learning and collective action. I do this by hypothesizing 4 different processes and using social networks to test them. So the first process can be summarized in the following statement. I may not change my views regarding climate change, but I feel I understand you better and that you understand me better. Therefore, this mutual understanding would be enough to allow us to collaborate and to reach agreement in collective action and implementing some adaptation action in our community. Another process would be that summarized here as you and I are different and have very different kinds of knowledge. I learned from you over time and I changed my views about the environmental problems because of our interactions. So here we are hypothesizing that a change in perceptions would be necessary in order to arrive to collective action. The third process is a combination of the 2 previous processes, but mutual understanding would be the result of co-attendance or stakeholder participation. But mutual understanding would also be a prerequisite for social learning as changes in perceptions. Process number 4 is looking at the directionality in the opposite direction. In this case, we want to see if mutual understanding ties are being driven by similarity in perceptions, or perhaps co-attendance is being driven by a homogeneous perceptions group holding homogeneous perceptions. These processes were translated into hypotheses, and using this data, which is a similar ICRA data. However, what I do here is that I update the Deal Island Peninsula data in this analysis, and I fix the number of participants to 60, which is the total number of unique participants across the 3 waves. Here, I use the network of mutual understanding and participation as a co-attendance matrix. So in participation, we're looking at if two people have a tie if they attend to the same events. Now, I chose to do mutual understanding here for 2 reasons. Number one is because in study 2, mutual understanding had the highest predictive power when modeled by itself compared to other networks. Now, another thing is that mutual understanding is a very important and dominant recurrent theme and concept in the literature of stakeholder participation. So it would make a lot of sense to focus on mutual understanding. The perceptions of climate change are basically the same as study number 2. Here, I use a modeling approach called the Stochastic Actor-Oriented Model, or the SOUM, which models network changes in thousands of microsteps, considering the tendency of an actor to change the surrounding structure at every time step, depending on the specified effects, simulating the coevolution of a network and actor attributes simultaneously, and simultaneously estimating whether the behavior can be estimated as a function of the network structure, and network structure is estimated as a function of the behavioral data. Here in this study, we can visualize that the same conceptual approach for the model in this way, having the co-attendance and mutual understanding ties on one side and the perceptions of climate change on the other side, and estimating this process, right? Which process is more dominant, which one is happening, which one is not happening, and to what extent. We additionally include other covariates. The results are summarized in this table. These are the results for period 1, which I will show you the period number 2 results in a moment. So period 1 has the change between wave 1 and wave 2, and period 2 would have the change between wave 2 and wave 3. Now, this is a confusing table, so let me walk you through it. As I mentioned, there's 2 parts of this modeling approach, the network changes and the perception changes, and we have them signaled here. Remember, there are 2 networks. There's the mutual understanding networks and there's the co-attendance network. Now, there's another thing I have to tell you, that this modeling approach includes default endogenous effects because we are modeling networks. And networks, as opposed to other types of data that is independent, they are linked together, this observation. So in a sense, we have to control for the natural tendencies of networks to form ties and to form triangles. After controlling for all of that, we can look into our specified effects. Okay, so hypothesis number 1. Co-attendance predicts the forming of mutual understanding tie. Here we find a positive and significant effects. That means that yes. Hypothesis 2, co-attendance predicts similarity in climate change perceptions. No, we don't have a signal for that. We also don't have a signal that mutual understanding ties would lead to a similarity in perceptions. But when including the process number 4 effects, the other direction of the modeling approach, we see that stakeholders that share similar views on climate change and or are the same type of stakeholder, they tend to mutually understand one another. Although similarity in perception and also stakeholder type does not predict co-attendance. Well, this is a good thing, the bottom one, because you do want to have a very heterogeneous group of stakeholders attending your meetings. So in a way, this is a very important non-finding. So the results for period 2 are very consistent to the period 1. So this is good. Basically, the same applies here. So here's a summary of the 4 hypotheses and how they basically respond based on our modeling approach and our data here in the case study, Deal Island. So what does this mean? It means that in terms of what participation accomplishes, it demonstrates that co-attending meetings, participating, leads to significant positive feelings of mutual understanding among stakeholders. This may lead to collective action. Even when considering the possibility of actors forming ties with similar others, this relationship still holds. Mutual understanding ties are formed by co-attendance and similarity in individuals. So these 2 processes are true. But participation is definitely important in producing ties of mutual understanding. So I believe this study contributes empirical analysis of 2 social processes discussed in the participation literature. One is the social learning one, and the other one is the mutual understanding. Social learning has been defined in many ways, and in a way, it continues to be difficult to pinpoint the meaning of this. This study shows that changing each other's perceptions is not a prerequisite to collective action. Translated means it's not a prerequisite to collaborate with others. It's not a prerequisite to arrive to outcomes that are desired for a public good. It seems that social learning is more about building awareness. So now we can go down to the discussion and the conclusion of the entire dissertation. A quick summary of the main scientific contributions by study is in study 1, we saw that climate change is driving environmental impacts in the Chesapeake Bay, and there is an imminent need to address this impact in participatory ways. Study 2, participatory networks of mutual understanding, respect, and influence are associated with perceptions of climate change. Monitoring these networks can help ensure participatory approaches are achieving desired outcomes. Lastly, in study 3, participation leads to mutual understanding ties, but not social learning, as in change in perceptions. So in a way, this study contributes to an improved understanding of social learning towards the building of awareness. We do have important limitations to acknowledge as well. For example, perceptions of climate change here, they focused on gathering beliefs and values of participants rather than objective knowledge of their climate change knowledge. There is a big reason why to focus on perceptions, and this is because studies do show that people often act and take action based on what they perceive. However, I think it was very important to acknowledge that if I would have both of these types of perceptions, climate change perceptions of beliefs, as well as knowledge, it would make a much richer analysis. The network size is also not very large. This is not specifically a problem for study number 2 using a panel approach, but it may have potentially been a limiting factor in the estimation of behavioral changes in study number 3. It is difficult to maintain a consistent network boundary in participatory studies. It's a real challenge acknowledged by many academics in this field. Not every participant stakeholder is going to show up to all the 10 or 15 meetings that you're going to hold over the course of many years. So collecting data is challenging. There are other networks, right? I'm only looking at 4 networks in one study and 2 in the other. Networks like trust could also be explored. So we're constrained by that. Also, I think it's important to mention that perhaps capturing changes in perception. So if that's the goal of the research and perhaps the goal of the participation of some people, 2.5 years might not be enough to capture changes in perceptions. It was enough to capture the dynamics of the network and how they change network ties over this period, but perhaps perceptions take a little longer to change. I believe there is an important opportunities for future research of this kind, including adding additional networks that are found in the literature, for example, trust and advice. These are important aspects that could also lead participants to change their mind about something issues. Other types of perceptions are also important to be included in the analysis. I was only using climate change perceptions, but there's other aspects of vulnerability or risk, and they're important maybe to compare them to each other. When it comes to management of Deal Island Peninsula and similar case studies, I would say that a combination of social network analysis with qualitative research methods like interviews or analyzing workshop transcripts could provide an expanded understanding of the situation on the ground and could provide more concrete policy recommendations for this community. Lastly, this research has policy implications, practical implications, especially this is my favorite part when it comes to what I can do with this knowledge. I believe that this research moves forward monitoring and evaluation of stakeholder participation. Participation is becoming ever more popular and also more needed than ever. We need to understand how to measure its performance and its quality. And I think studies like this can move that needle forward. This study is also in line with UN Sustainable Development Goals 17, promoting public and private-public and civil society partnerships. You know, when we are dealing with imminent climate impacts in different parts of the world, but at the same time, we are focusing on moving towards sustainable development, economic benefits, and a better quality of life. It definitely requires collaboration of different sectors. Adaptation practitioners may start thinking about gathering network-based data and use network perspectives in the management of social ecological systems. Also, policymakers and funding agencies may consider requiring funded projects that employ participatory approaches to measure their performance. And hey, if they want to call me to help them out to measure those, I'm available. So I want to give some final remarks. It has been a real journey to be here, and I have learned a lot. I have gained a deeper understanding of the coupled human environmental systems and the challenges that exist and what it takes to make a difference. Stakeholder participation is more than just a concept. It's about people that need to be part of the solution. Even when we have conflicting views or beliefs, more than ever, we need to understand how to develop mutual understanding if we want to move forward as a society, as a country, and as an international community. The field of social network analysis is definitely taking off, and modeling approaches are being developed to model complex interactions between social and ecological systems. And I believe that many great tools are being developed right now that are going to empower us, scientists and decision makers, to understand the complexity of the challenges we face in this century. Now, I look forward to engaging with the big problems of our lifetime, and I feel equipped with a better worldview and the capacity to engage in science-based problem solving. Finally, I want to give thanks to my wife for her support, for being with me all the time, and for encouraging me. I want to thank my parents, Francisco and Leticia, for believing in me. And I want to thank a big, sincere thanks to my friends in the United States, my colleagues, you know who they are, and as well as my new friends here in the Netherlands. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
May I invite everyone to unmute and show their faces, and we give Daniel a nice round of applause for a moment. Yay. Okay. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Daniel, for that nice presentation.